Hi everyone and welcome to my channel. In this video I'm talking about how to play if you think you're the worst player at the table or one of the worst players. So this video is for the rare 10% or so of poker players who think they're below average rather than average or better than average. And imagine the situation, so you want to play a bucket list tournament once in your life, but it's quite expensive, or you unexpectedly won a satellite into a big tournament way above your buy-in, and you admit to yourself that it's going to be tough, but you want to put up a good fight and lose the least basically in expectation and have a good chance of, if luck swings your way, you profit big. Or maybe also if it's your first tournament ever, you've dabbled in poker a bit, but you kind of lack confidence and you would like a strategy that gives you a good chance in that sort of tournament. And so this video is about what to do in this case. And generally, winning at poker comes down to two things. So make fewer mistakes with the hands that you're dealt, which is GTO play, game theory optimal play, and then capitalizing on other people's mistakes, which is exploiting others. And I have some advice for how to think about these two things when we know that we're gonna make some mistakes because we're understudied compared to others. So one part is to reduce your chances of making particularly big mistakes, one part of the strategy advice. And the reasoning here is that mistakes aren't all the same. Like a lot of mistakes if you play against the GTO bot and then look at what it says, how you play did, will be very small mistakes. Like they lose 0.01 big blinds in the hand. And those things really don't matter. But then there are other mistakes that can get really quite large. And so the strategy should focus on avoiding your chances of making big blunders, basically. And then for the other part, exploitative play, if you learn how pros exploit beginners, then you can first reduce the exploit surface, like make it a bit harder for them to just exploit you. And the main thing there is don't telegraph what you're doing, don't play too transparent. You need to add a bit of deception. And then also the second thing, so the inherent nature of exploitative play is that when a pro tries to exploit an amateur, that actually opens up the pro to counter exploits. And so if you cleverly do something that goes contrary to your image, you can maybe get one back and win a big pot that would have gone a different way because the pro was playing an exploit and you countered it. But don't put too much hope in that. Pros are clever. They've dealt with clever amateurs. And I don't think you're likely to become a winning player doing that. But if you just get one of these through in the course of a tournament, it will really help you reduce your loss rate and also make you harder to play against, more less predictable. So yeah, let's get into it. I will have 3 pieces of advice for the 2 parts for reduce your chances of making particularly big mistakes, and then 3 pieces of advice for playing contrary to your image. So in part 1, the first piece of advice is play a position tighter. And that's because the weakest opening hands in GTO opening ranges, they don't make a lot of money. They can even be literally 0 EV sometimes. And sometimes they're just very low EV. And that is what they make for the solver if we assume perfect play post flop and against 3 bets, continuous, and so on. And if you're understudied, you have a bigger chance of making mistakes with these hands, and then they may not even be profitable at all. So just folding them is the safer play and keeps your losing rate at a small number. And here's an example. So if you look at a cutoff opening range, this is a GTO wizard opening range here. So all these hands in red are meant to open under game theory optimal strategy. Here we are 30 blinds effective. But if you look at the compare EV tool, so here's a strategy tab. Then if you click on it, you have various options to select. One of them is compare EV, and then you compare the EV between, here it is, raising and folding, and you see how the hands do. And a hand like a6 offsuit is here a pure open, but when you look at the EV, it's 0 EV. Same goes for queen 9 offsuit, jack 9 offsuit, 10 9 offsuit. They're 0 EV or 0.01. And so cutting out these hands really just makes your life easier, basically. And then what remains, so you want to open hands that are quite dark green. And that roughly comes down to what it would be like to open one position earlier. Because if you compare here the greener hands with a hijack opening range, which is one position earlier, it's roughly the same as what you would open from the hijack. So if you're studying hand ranges a bit, obviously you don't have to be very accurate with it. Just try to maybe open one position earlier. And that, I think, will go well for you in this situation. And then under the gun 8 is the first person to act at an 8-handed table. And there is no earlier range than that. So here's just what I would suggest. If you're shallow stacked, so 30 big blinds and shallower, ace jack offsuit is still a good hand to open, because shallow stacked high cards become more valuable, because it's just less of a problem if both of you hit top pair and one person has the higher kicker. At 100 big blinds deep, it's quite a disaster when this happens and you put too much money in the pot, and then you sometimes have to fold when you have top pair with a bad kicker. But at 30 big blinds deep, the money is just going in, and if they have it, they have it. And the ace jack offsuit is still a very strong hand when it hits top pair. So shallow ace jack offsuit, king, queen offsuit are good opens from early position, and then these other hands that I mentioned here. Whereas deep, you don't even want to really open ace jack offsuit and king, queen offsuit. And you open suited broadways because they're really good, pocket fives and better, ace 4 suited and better, and you do need some bluffs and some hands for deception or board coverage. So I would put in some of these suited connectors, or here like hands like 10-9 suited, king 9 suited, queen 9 suited, and so on. I'll talk later a bit more about why this is important. And here we just see an example. This is now 80 big blinds deep, and so ace jack offsuit is actually making a little bit of money, but it's easy to misplay, so I would recommend to just start with ace queen offsuit. Similar for king queen offsuit, makes a bit more money than ace jack offsuit, but also a hand that is hard to play, and you'd rather play ace 5 suited or queen 10 suited, jack 10 suited. And then the same principle obviously goes not just for opens, but also for defending your big blind. I would recommend looking at what a solver does, and you cut out the weakest defense. Note though that you shouldn't take this too far, and beginners actually have a tendency to defend the big blind way too tight, and you don't want to go too far. And also people who play cash game ranges where there is no ante and where players have to pay rake. In cash game, you're meant to defend the big blind much tighter, whereas in tournaments, for instance, you almost never fold a suited hand in the big blind against just one raise. You do fold it if they raise 2.5x from the earliest position. You can fold like 7-2 suited. But yeah, if there's no payjump pressure, so if more than 50% of the field are still left, you probably do just want to defend suited hands because they play kind of easy. You either hit a flush draw or backdoor flush draw with something else going for it, or you don't, and then they just become easy folds. So tighten up the big blind defense, but don't make the mistake of just folding way too much in the big blind. And if it sounds to you like this is just a really smart strategy and you're wondering like, why does anyone play these low EV hands? Why not make poker simple and still only play hands that are very profitable, won't you just make a really big profit doing this? So remember this viral tweet that went around 2 years or so ago, where a lot of people had this reaction when they saw some statistic that much of the profit comes from the small number of premium hands here. And the reason why it's not a good idea for everyone to play like this is just because you need to remember that all players get dealt good hands at the same frequency in the long run. So just by playing hands that are quote unquote profitable, you're not actually making a profit at poker at large, because other people will also get dealt aces, kings, queens, and jacks. And if both of you play these same hands, it's a zero-sum game between the two of you and no one wins. And then the person who plays more hands that are profitable, even if they're slightly more profitable than zero, then that person wins more. So all is equal, if you're actually good at poker, it is good to play all profitable spots. And then a second reason is that if you want to improve at poker, it is a really good strategy to put yourself into tough situations, because that's the main way in which you can learn and in which you get better. So I think this isn't a viable strategy for players who want to take poker very seriously in the future and get better. But it is good for having this one like bucket list tournament, or this one big satellite where you really want to play well because the money or the experience matters to you. And then advice piece number 2 is max late reg, because registering at the last possible hour or half hour or last 10 minutes provides an instant boost in expected value because of the Payjump Pressure dynamics. So when stacks have already gone out, you are closer to the bubble, and doubling up a chip stack is not quite twice as good at translating into actual money paid out in mincash and payjumps than it would be to lose your starting stack. And so because when you max late register at the latest point, there will be many stacks that are 5 times the starting stack, but they're actually not worth 5 times the starting stack. They're maybe only worth 4 times the starting stack. And the extra value that is lost when players go out and other players double up has to go somewhere. And it goes to the smaller stacks just becoming increasingly more valuable than they would be at the start of the tournament. And that's why it depends on the structure, but the later they allow you to register, the lower the average stack, the more EV boost you get. And then also there's an additional advantage. If you register late, you avoid deep stacked situations where it's easier to make big mistakes. Of course, it depends a bit how studied you are. If you never study short stack plays, maybe you will make bigger mistakes when everyone is short stacked. But the thing here is that short stacked play is less complex to study. So if you actually have the time to study, even just for like a couple of weeks, study half an hour a day for 2 weeks, you can get good enough at short stack play to make less mistakes short stacked than you would deep stacked. I'm quite confident in that. And then if you do that, late registration becomes quite a good play for you. Then obviously a caveat. So of course, if you're playing for the experience, for instance, WSOP Main Event, you don't just want to go there, register with, I think it's 40 big blinds or so. It's actually deeper than many other tournaments when you late register. But still, you might go out really early and then you have a bad time. And if you're there for playing, then just go there on day one and have a good time, and don't make it about the money as much. Make it about the experience as well. But still, maybe then skip the 300 deep level where it's possible to make bigger mistakes if you're not used to playing quite deep stacked. And some deep stack advice if you do want to register early. So be aware of reverse implied odds. Play hands with not potential, not hands like Queen 8 suited that makes the bad end of a straight, or a flush that is kind of strong but could be outflushed by stronger flush. And then also, don't just think that because a hand goes multi-way you have good pot odds and you have to play everything. So in live poker there are a lot of multi-way situations, but it's often just fine to fold when there are lots of players to a flop. And even a hand like a7 suited against good ranges, you might think, oh, I can make the not flush, so I should always call if it's not too costly, but it's actually not that good, and it's better to fold unless you get a very, very good price, because when there are 4 other people in the pot, you're not meant to really get paid off when you make a nut flush, because everyone is wary of the fact that other people might have big flushes too in this sort of spot. And so you would get paid a lot more when you make flush versus flush against just 1 or 2 other players rather than in a pot of 5 people. And then needless to say, another caveat, if you're a winning cash game player, but you think you're below average at tournaments just because you never studied tournaments, then of course you want to play from early on, because that's the part that is most similar to cash game and where you will be good at. Just remember that as you approach the money bubble, other players will tighten up their ranges because of ICM and Payjump Pressure considerations. And if you continue to play your usual cash game inspired style, your bluffs and thin value bets will become worse and worse. And it's no longer really advisable to play the same style. So you have to adjust the way you play as well as the in the money stage gets closer. And when does this happen? So I'll talk more about ICM a bit later, but just briefly, I would say that adjustments become definitely mandatory at 30% of the field left, and even at less than 50% of the field left, there is like a case to be made for it, but it's somewhat, basically poker pros have different opinions and approaches to it, so it's not like very clear cut. It depends a bit, I would say. But 30%, there's really no question, and you need to make big adjustments. The third piece of advice is prioritize shallow stack studying, and especially, which is maybe counterintuitive, especially all-in lines where you can get your stack all in. And my reasoning here is that if you go all in pre-flop with the correct play, there's nothing even the best players in the world can do, because you can no longer make a mistake. All your chips are in, and as long as you can't even accidentally mock your hand, because once a player is all in, I think the dealer will open your hand. So there's literally nothing bad that can happen to you in that hand once you went all in. And the important part is you want to go all in with a correct play. But these are somewhat easy to study for shallow stack situations because there's just not too much complexity. And so I'll give some examples of studying priorities. So one is just open shoves, meaning if you're first to act and you have a stack that is 10 big blinds deep, then open shoving is the dominant strategy. When you have only 10 big blinds, to a first approximation, you want to play all in or fold. The one exception is that aces and kings are so strong that going all in is a bit overkill, and you'd rather raise 2 big blinds and then go from there, so that the big blind will defend it against you, for instance, and then you win more chips against the big blind. And to balance that, you're meant to have like a few bluffs. So like the worst hand that is just slightly too bad to go all in, worst ace-x offsuit, can be your one bluff that you also min raise, for instance. But yeah, 10 deep, it's all in or fold, and then 15 big blinds deep, a lot of hands benefit from going outright all in, but you also play min raises from this stack, and you do not play 15 deep all-ins from positions earlier than the low jack, so that's a good thing to remember. It's actually a mistake to say you have pocket eights and you're the first player at the 8-handed table. You might think, I just go all in, it cannot be too bad, it's easier to play, I just want to be done with the hand, you go all in. That's quite a big mistake actually, because it's just too many big blinds. It's fine if no one calls you and then the big blind calls you with something, whatever, but if someone behind you goes all in and then another player goes all in, then you could have easily gotten away from the hand if you had just put in 2 big blinds and then someone goes all in and the other player goes all in. So you keep a lot of option value by raising 2 big blinds and seeing what happens with all the players behind you, and that's worth more than just going all in straight away. But if you're in a late position, the all in is best, and you will see charts later where you can see examples of this. And then another spot is reshoves. So meaning when someone opens, and especially if they open in later positions, for instance, hijack or cutoff, and then it's your turn in the small blind or big blind, a lot of your defense in these positions, out of position, when you're first to act when the flop comes, and therefore benefit less from seeing what the other player does, it's harder to play. A lot of your defense will be just going all in and sort of putting the pressure on the other player. And these happen especially frequently at 15 big blinds or also 20 big blinds, and are worth studying at these stack depths because there's not too much that can go wrong. Of course, if you have 20 big blinds and there's a player who always raises to 3 big blinds with their strong hands and to 2 big blinds with their weak hands, and then they raise 3 big blinds from the hijack, and you have a hand where you know the chart says to go all in, but it's like one of your weakest all in hands, definitely don't go all in, because the player is telegraphing their strength with the bigger raise size. So if you pay attention, you won't miss this sort of opportunity to exploit their sizing tell, basically. But otherwise, there's really not much that can go wrong, and I recommend going with these charts and just find ways to get your shallow stack all in, because that reduces mistakes. And then lastly, there's also, it's worth studying just how thresholds go down when you're less deep, and how when you're out of position, so cutoff versus a button 3-bet, you react against the 3-bet by going all in a lot with your value hands. You don't really call and see what comes with the flop when you have a strong hand. So if you have a hand like ace queen offsuit or 9s through kings, you just go all in from the cutoff facing a button 3-bet if the button is aggressive and has bluffs. If the button never has bluffs, it's more difficult to navigate, and calling becomes an option, because if they only have ace king or a pair, then some of these all-ins are no longer great. Here's an example of the cutoff versus button spot. This is GTO Lab. I think they have ranges for free now, so you can see their pre-flop ranges for free. And here you can see often it's a bad idea to go all in with ace queen when you're deeper stacked, but if the stacks get only 30 big blinds, even in a position pair cutoff versus button, so not small blind versus big blinds where it's even looser, ace queen offsuit is just an all in for value. And then you can have bluffs, but bluffs are less important because your opponent doesn't always know whether you bluff or not. But the important part is to find the value raises, because that's just the best play with ace queen here. And again, that will be different when it gets closer to the pay jumps, but before you get into that area, there's just, if you're a below average player, there's just nothing better than you can do than finding ways to get your stack in that make money in the solver. Now some other examples for charts. So here's a raise first in chart at 10 big blinds, and this is how I made it easier to learn, just with different colors, so everything is on one chart. So this color, red, is under the gun 8, first player to act at an 8-handed table. And as you can see, you need to have a surprisingly strong hand here because there's so many players behind you. So ace-9 offsuit is just not good enough. Maybe you can use it as a min raise alongside aces and kings because these hands are a bit too weak to go all in directly, but all these other hands I would just go all in that position. And then to give another example from the button, the hands that go all in is every suited king, queen 6 suited and better, even 8-7 suited goes all in. King 8 offsuit is the worst offsuited king, and every suited ace, every offsuited ace goes all in, because we see here that even from the cutoff purple color, ace 2 offsuit is an all in. It's probably not printing money, and similarly here, the worst, like queen 10 offsuit. These hands are probably low EV or zero EV to go all in, but that's okay, because in the other example, when we were deeper, we didn't want to open zero EV hands because there was a big chance of making mistakes post flop. But if your open is an outright all in, you're not going to make mistake post flop. So this is the best way to play. And if you're up against a pro who thinks they have an edge on the field, they might even fold profitable calling hands to reduce their variance, and that, if anything, makes you do better in the tournament. So yeah, again, that's why I recommend just finding these all-ins, and in your studying, focus on them. Here now, 15 big blinds, an example where we are raised first in from the cutoff position. And red is the all-ins. These hands, you just go all in and the hand is done. And the yellow ones are meant to be min-raise opens. Here it is okay to follow the principle of cutting off out the worst open. So, maybe you don't have to open king 9 offsuit or king 6 suited. You can think about that. You can maybe also think about simplifying things, like if you're not sure how to play ace 7 suited, maybe it's okay to just go all in, even though the hand is maybe a bit too strong and meant to make more money min raising. But you don't want to just go all in with 10s to simplify your play, because even a bad player, I think, will make more money at this low stack depth playing post flop or inducing other players to go all in as a bluff or so, and then obviously you're calling. So everything that is to the left or above the all in region is meant to call against the opponents going all in behind you, and everything that's below is meant to fold. So the hand that go all in outright are often the hands that would feel a bit awkward if they min raise and then face an all in. They're a bit too weak to call in that situation, but they are so strong that they would regret not having gone all in first. So that's why these hands play well as all ins. And so you know that if the difference between king 8 suited here, which is to the right of this cluster, and king jack suited, is king 8 suited is not quite good enough to go all in, and after it raised and faces an all in, it will fold. King jack suited is a bit too good to go all in from this position, at least. And then when the opponent goes all in, you grudgingly call it off, and it's still good enough with pot odds and so on. Here's an example of a re-shove spot. So someone opens and you just go all in against their open. You get, if they fold, you get the 2 blinds they put in and the big blind and the antes. So this is quite a profitable play it's hard to defend against. A lot of people open too wide, and then when they fold, this is just really profitable. So memorizing these dark blue all-ins can be really quite nice and profitable. So this is the small blind spot. And then similarly, a big blind spot, here you also see that the purple hands are folds, and it depends on the sizing. So this is just for a min raise. If the raise bigger, you fold more. And also you would fold more if you were deeper stacked. So if you're shallow stacked, it's easier to realize equity with hands like Jack 3 offsuit. And if you were deeper stacked and they min raise, you also fold more. So you have to look at nuanced charts too when you're memorizing defend ranges. But again, if you're below average in the field, you probably just should fold a bit more than this anyway. But you shouldn't miss any all-ins, because once you go all in, you'll no longer make any mistakes. And the red is a non-all-in race. You can completely ignore this. It's hard to study, it's hard to execute. Don't focus on the stuff. What I want you to focus on, if you want to learn the strategy that I recommend, is mostly memorizing the blue parts. And same here for against cutoff instead of button. Yeah, a lot of blue here, and this should go quite well for you when you execute it in game. Here is blind versus blind. Again, you can ignore the difference between yellow and green. Yellow is raised to 2.5 or 2.3. Green would be just limping, purple folding. But the important part here is just don't miss the all-in. If something is poorly blue, it's probably just good for you to memorize it and execute. And you do want to understand maybe the mechanics behind why hands do what they do. So just why is there this half moon shape? It is because these hands are all strong enough to go all in, and obviously the stronger hands also would be strong to go all in. So if 10-7 suited can go all in, 10-8 suited would be strong enough to go all in too. But poker is always about comparing different options and finding the best one, not just finding enough option that is profitable. You want to find the option that is most profitable. And 10-7 suited just gets more hands to fold that would dominate it if we just limp, if we just call the big blind. So when 10-7 suited goes all in, the big blind folds Jack 7, Queen 7, King 7. Yeah, but then when if a hand like Queen 10 suited were to go all in, the big blind would call with better hands. Like they would call King Queen, Ace Queen, Queen Jack suited, they would probably call, and they will fold Queen 9, Queen 8, Queen 7, Queen 6, 10-9, 10-8, and so on. So hands that benefit from going all in are hands that would often be dominated if they just call, and they have to be strong enough to go all in. So Jacks 4 suited would also get a lot of hands that dominated to fold, but it's just too weak when it gets called. So that's why here the difference is Jack 5 suited, 10-6 suited, and so on. But with these sort of hands, it's actually not too important to know the exact difference. Like, is it Jack 4 suited or Jack 5 suited? What you can also do is just sort of know that there's this half moon shape and sort of intuitively reason about, if you limp and face an all-in, will you feel like this is quite an unfortunate outcome and your hand was strong enough to go all in? Then just play it as an all-in outright. And yeah, otherwise, if your hand is it's not that much of a tragedy to get blown off it, then you just limp and see what they do. And if you limp like check 3 suited, they go all in. Whatever, you just fold. We've seen this one. So now an important side note or a clarification that everything I've talked about thus far, all these ways of getting your shallow stack all in, they are good only to the point where Payjump pressure starts to matter a lot. And I would say there aren't really adjustments necessary to the charts when there's like 50% of the field less or slightly less. That's meant to say less. Because when you deep stacked, the first adjustments that ICM would recommend deep stacked would be similar to what you're already doing. Just get rid of fringe defense and tighten up a little. And then when you shallow stacked, so in these like 20 big blinds and shallower spot where it's often the strategy is to find ways to go all in, if you're shallower than the tournament average, you're too far away from the money to tighten up too much. Because if you get tighter, you just bleed more chips on average, and then you get even shallower. And if it's still a long way to go before the money, that's just not a sustainable strategy. So the point where you really want to change the strategy is roughly at 30% of the field left, maybe 33%, something like that. And at that point, you really should no longer follow the chip EV charts that I just showed. Even for shallow spots, even for 10 deep, even for 15 deep, even for, even 10 deep, the thresholds go up and the stacks play as though they are deeper. So you just want to increase the thresholds where hands are good enough to put all the money in. And I recommend, so I have a video on Payjump Pressure in multi-table tournaments on my channel that I recommend watching just to get an introduction to that concept. Here I'll assume that you know what ICM means and what Payjump Pressure is. But just to recap and to give you some heuristics for playing, Payjump Pressure is highest approaching either the bubble and the final table. After the bubble burst, it's okay to go back to your usual strategy. So after the bubble burst, Payjump Pressure for the average stack gets a lot lower than before the bubble. And then how final tables differ from bubbles. So when you approach the bubble, it is short stacks, and especially short stacks that are pretty short, so they don't have anything to gain from doubling up, don't have much to gain. But they're still, they have enough chips that they could probably fold into the money in like most scenarios, and that's when they're under the most pressure. And then if you're playing mystery bounty formats, in mystery bounty format, the mincash is smaller because half the money goes into the bounty prize pool, so the mincash is smaller. And the stacks that are under the most bubble pressure are actually middling stacks that cover a few players at the table, or cover maybe half the players at the table, or at least 40% or so. They are under the most pressure because their situation is really good and they have a lot to lose, because if they become crippled or they go out, then they have no chance at the bounty, and the bounty is where most of the money is going to be once you make the money. And then on final tables, it's mid stacks and big stacks that have the most pressure, especially when they play against bigger stacks. And so those stacks have enough chips to ladder many pay jumps, make a lot of money just by staying out of each other's way. So for them, it's the biggest catastrophe if they unnecessarily play a big pot and lose it. So then what are the biggest mistakes under ICM? So one common mistake pre-bubble is playing too many marginal hands. Especially playing them passively can be a big mistake. Big blind defense in particular, they the big blind tightens up a lot, and a lot more even than I would recommend at the early stages of a tournament. So once Payjump Pressure increases, if you are the covered stack and you face someone who plays aggressively post-flop, you basically just defend your big blind with hands that have a high potential of making something really good, where you would feel comfortable just calling their barrels to put you to the test all in. So you maybe like defending King 10 offsuit is fine, because if you hit top pair, it's going to be a good top pair, and you feel probably comfortable bluff catching or raising all in against their c-bet if you're shallow stacked. Or like suited hands, especially hands like 6-5 suited or 9-7 suited, they're good enough because they can flop straights or flushes or strong draws that you can call once and see if you hit the turn. So those hands are good, but then hands like 8-4 suited or King 9 offsuit, they're often just too weak and they will get you into trouble when you play them. So it's better to ditch them early instead of calling pre-flop, maybe calling the flop or turn, but then on the river, you're just going to fold anyway against pressure. So why are you in the pot with those hands in the first place? And then somewhat similar principle is when you're not in the big blind and someone opens, it's a mistake to call opens too much, basically. So like, it's rarely bad to flat hands like ace queen offsuit or ace queen suited, ace jack suited, pocket tens when it's not strong enough to clearly get in. That's not terrible, but many other hands that would ordinarily make for acceptable flat calls, hands like king 10 suited, queen 10 suited, jack 9 suited, low pocket pairs, especially ace 4 suited, hands like that, they just become really bad to play under ICM conditions, because the big thing about ICM is that winning chips is less good than losing the same amount of chips is bad. So you just want to avoid situations where you flat call because you get good pot odds, but the pot odds mean that it's fine if you only win the hand 30% of the time. In ICM, this actually becomes negative, because if you lose chips 70% of the time, those chips that you lose were more valuable than the chips that you win whenever you hit or the pot goes your way. So just don't get yourself in these situations. You will just be bleeding chips that are valuable for making sure that you make the money, or valuable at the final table for making sure that you make pay jumps. But then don't take it too far. Being too tight too early can also be a big mistake. So often people get scared at the bubble when there's still 50% of the field left and it'll just take a long time. And if you tighten up too early, you will bleed chips, and then at the end you have 4 big blinds and you still realize that you won't make it into the money folding, and then you maybe still have to risk going all in and you bubble anyway. Or in a way that's also really frustrating, maybe you make the money but you have 2 big blinds left, and earlier you had a good stack and you passed up on an opportunity where you could have called an all in with ace king or gone all in against a bullying stack with a hand like ace queen, and they would have probably folded and then everything would have gone differently. So if you dare to minimize regrets, just remember that being too tight and too scared can also be a big regret and a big mistake. So it can go both ways, and your goal is to make sure you play well in both directions, too tight and too loose. Some heuristics for how to play in ICM. So yeah, it's a spectrum, but the more Payjump Pressure, the more you gradually move towards 3-bet or fold mentality, or 4-bet or fold. So basically raise or fold, except when you're in the big blind. In the big blind, you mostly just tighten up a lot with your defense. And then covering stacks are meant to bluff more, because they get to leverage the fact that it's less of a problem for them when they lose a big pot. Whereas covered stacks actually bluff less, and if you're a covered stack, your bluffs just become your good hands that could also have called on the different circumstances. But now, because of the payjump pressure, you want to play this raise or fold strategy. So you don't really need quote unquote pure bluffs. You bluff your good hands and you values your very good hands. And so one example, if the payjump pressure is really high, the solver strategy might be that when someone opens from early position, you fold a hand as strong as ace jack offsuit, you just 3-bet with ace queen offsuit and fold when they 4-bet, and you 3-bet ace king offsuit as well, and if they 4-bet, you go all in. And a hand like pocket tens might just fold outright, because if it's not strong enough to raise to get it in, then it's kind of just a bluff, especially in a scenario where your opponent also won't play many calls against you, because they also play this ICM strategy where they raise or fold. And so if tens is just a bluff, then it's actually a worse bluff blocker wise than ace queen, because ace queen blocks more of their really good hands, aces, ace king, queens, and so on. And the last part in terms of ICM advice is it's important to always think who you're up against, not just in terms of player personality, is this player aggressive, capable of bluffing, and so on, but also what is their situation in the tournament. Are they at a big stack depth where they can bully others, or are they themselves under ICM pressure? And if you play against someone who's ordinarily has been quite aggressive early in the tournament, but now they're the covered stack and they're at risk of not making pay jumps, you can actually expect them to be a lot more conservative in their opening range and to have fewer bluffs, because good players know that you just kind of bluff as the cover stack. It's just bad for you. So think about who you're up against, and remember that big stacks can open wider ranges to pressure stacks that they're covering, and they can overbluff with their 3-betting range, or are meant to do that. By contrast, other mid stacks against you as a mid stack, they should play more strong ranges, and they shouldn't really play a lot of pure bluffs. They just should play good hands, basically. So against big stacks, it's often the best defense if you have a strong hand, but it's kind of vulnerable, to just go all in, because they're opening a wide range. So very often they will just have bad cards, like maybe they open king 5 offsuit or ace 3 offsuit to bully others, and then you go all in. What are they going to do? They're just going to fold. But then when you're playing against another mid stack that is also under pressure, if you go all in against the mid stack, you have less fold equity. And if you were to merely call in the big blind, there's a good chance both of you will play quite passively, and it often checks down, because neither of you really benefits a lot from just doing something very risky. So a good example here is, let's say you have like 22 big blinds, you defend the big blind against the cutoff, and then if the cutoff is chip leader and you're kind of approaching the bubble, but it's not like super close yet, it's just okay to go all in with ace 10 offsuit even against a chip leader who opens truly as wide as they should, because they will just very often have a bad hand that they have to fold. And if you just call, it's not going to be easy to play ace 10 offsuit against a chip leader who will always c-bet and bluff you off the hand. So, and even if you hit a 10, it's kind of going to be hard to navigate sometimes if there are overcards or whatever. So just simplify your life and go all in. Similarly, you wouldn't go all in with a hand like queen jack offsuit, because it is too weak even against a wide cutoff opening range. But once you hit the flop and they c-bet, a mistake that a lot of players make close to the bubble is that they call, and then the turn is kind of a bad card. They're not sure, maybe they call again, and then on the river they fold because the board gets even scarier and the other player plays an aggressive strategy, uses the scary cards to their advantage. And if you look it up in the solver, it's very possible that you were just meant to go all in on the flop, win the pot, no need to trap, because your goal is just to pick up the chips that are in the pot. That's already good enough. And if you go all in, they will almost always fold. And if they have an overpair, so that's it. It's rare, and sometimes you have to lose. That's just how you need to play. By contrast, in both these examples, if the cutoff is not chip leader, but is a mid stack similar to you, now shoving in these spots suddenly becomes possibly quite bad. I mean, maybe on the check 7-4, it's probably still okay, and I would personally check raise. So this one is not catastrophic. But I would check raise non all in to have some maneuverability maybe. And then, but like going all in with ace 10 offsuit against the cutoff in this situation is just terrible, because they will tighten up in front of before the bubble. So here's a comparison with ranges by GTO Lab that has this compare functionality where you see different spots and that, but you can select them to have some similarities. And here on the left we have a chip leader opening, 177 players out of 1,000, and 150 make the money, so kind of close to the bubble, but not yet at the point where we want to just play an ultra tight strategy. So against the chip leader, even ace 9 offsuit is good enough to go all in, because it's just awkward to play as a call, and they are meant to fold a lot when we go all in, because they open so wide. Whereas on the right, here the cutoff opens quite a snug range, and then it would be bad to go all in with ace 9 offsuit or ace 10 offsuit. Yeah, so that's the important part here, is always think about who you're up against in terms of what is their situation with Payjump Pressure. To recap, we have now talked about part 1, reducing your chances of making particularly big mistakes. So we've covered the advice: play a position tighter, register maximally late, and prioritize shallow stack studying, especially all-in lines. And then there was this lengthy side note on ICM. And now comes the last part, which is part 2, how learn how pros exploit amateurs and play contrary to your image. Before I continue, if you're still watching the video and liking it, please consider subscribing to my channel. It's a pretty new project for me, and I don't have many subscribers yet, and I do put a lot of effort into the video, and will make more of them. The goal is 1 video per month. Not all my videos are for beginners, but some of them will be again in the future. Now let's get into the last part, part 2. So how pros exploit amateurs is mostly that the amateurs are very predictable, and then the pros know what to do. And an important part here is you need deception in your game. So probably only play one opening size. Some players open bigger when they have a strong hand, and they open smaller when they have a weak hand. That's clearly bad, because people will notice. In theory, it's okay if you're anyway playing a tighter range than the pros. It would be okay to raise a little bigger than the usual raise sizes that you see others use. But I don't necessarily recommend it if they don't yet know that you're a tight player. You're kind of telegraphing what you're doing if you raise bigger. So maybe just start out by opening standard opening size that pros use. But then once they have realized that you're playing tighter, you can raise slightly bigger, but just don't overdo it. Never raise like 3x or 4x. But if you want to go 2.5x or something instead of 2x, that can be okay or even good. Then have some bluffs pre-flop and post-flop. Yeah, we talked about this when I showed some range examples. Don't just play premium hands only. And then the big thing is, for some players at least, is avoid what I call fish mentality. So remember that poker is about making the most chips with your hand. It's not about ensuring that you never get drawn out on when you have a good hand. So when you have aces and the board is kind of wet, like it has a straight draw and the flush draw possible, some players with aces, they just bet like 1.5 times the pot instantly, like after 2 seconds of thinking, because their thought process is, oh no, I might get outdrawn, better make sure I win. But this is not how you make the most chips, and it can actually be good if the board is bad for you to check and let them bluff into you, because that way you have a chance of making money from hands that are worse than you. Whereas when you make a really big bet, it's transparent what you're doing, it's clear that you have value, and hands that are good but worse than yours will just find a way to fold, and hands that will actually have a good chance of drawing out on you and eventually beating you, only those will stay in. And that way you ensure that the only way you make money is when hands that continue against you are these draws that you're scared of. But you actually want to make money by, keeping other hands in and sometimes baiting the other player into bluffing into you. And yeah, so just play your value hands in the same way as you would sometimes play your give up hands. And that way you kind of incentivize people to bluff into you, and don't just play your value hands in a way where everyone knows that you clearly have a value hand and nothing else. And now a bit about different images and how to use them to your advantage. So I have 3 examples here on different slides. So if you're temperamentally tight, temperamentally loose passive, and temperamentally loose aggressive. So the first one, if you're temperamentally tight, if not to say nitty, understand that pros won't give you credit for putting enough money in the pot. So that means that they will often bet when they have a strong hand, because they know you won't bluff, right? So they have to bet. And when they check in a spot where they could easily bet, that's kind of when the pros are more weak than they should be. And that's when you could attack them going against your image. And so consider attacking lines where they would continue betting if they had something very strong. And then also when you bluff, make it count. Like some players who rarely bluff, when they bluff, they might be a bit timid and only bet like half pot. You don't have to go all in as an overbet or anything, but just think about a bet size that will really make their life difficult when you bluff. So basically, don't bluff too much, but when you do, make it count. And then also consider value betting thinly in a spot where you don't have a lot of slam dunk value hands. Because even pros, even if they don't have you tagged as a frequent bluffer, they're even less likely to give you credit for the thin value bet if you have like the typical image of an amateur, or the sort of behavior and the way you come across. People can often tell if someone hasn't played a lot. And they will kind of sniff this out, that you're representing either something that's very rare or you have to go fairly thin for value. And if they don't give you credit for the thin value bet, they might actually bluff catch you. And in those situations, it's good to go for not a massive sizing. So you can do something that looks bluff heavy. Next, so if you temperamentally lose passive, meaning you play a lot of hands, but you play them mostly by calling and checking and seeing flops and stuff, bad news. So loose passive play is some of the play that loses the most, and it's not easily salvageable. So you've got to get more disciplined. And if boredom is the issue, consider headphones so you entertain yourself in some other way instead of making the hand that you dealt your entertainment potential, even if it's something like 7-5 offsuit. And if the issue is instead lack of knowledge about ranges and you just play hands because they look pretty, they seem kind of strong, but you don't know where the thresholds are, then just study preflop opening ranges, even just a bit to get a rough idea, and then you will no longer make truly bad calls with, I don't know, bad offsuited hands against opens and stuff. Yeah, even just a bit of knowledge will be very helpful in that situation. And then lastly, if you temperamentally lose aggressive, that's an interesting one because compared to most people, most players, poker solvers are actually more loose aggressive than people's intuitions. And so this play can be quite strong. And a lot of winning players have that sort of temperament. But it's important to pick your spots and don't overdo it. So one mistake or bad habit I've seen people do, and I did early on in my poker playing, is that when I see someone telegraph that they have a strong hand, I do this thing where I think that surely it must be obvious to them that I know that they have a really strong hand. So if I now do something really crazy like raise or float the flop and then check raise the turn and go all in on the river, surely they will realize that only a madman would bluff here, so they have to fold their overpairs, their aces or whatever. And that just hasn't gone very well for me, and I think there's a reason for it, namely that yes, it's kind of a credible story when you race against someone who shows strength. In a way, makes your bluff more credible, and that's one argument in favor of bluffing. But there's a quite strong argument against bluffing, namely that many people, many humans don't like folding really strong hands. And you're just basically playing Russian roulette for no reason, and it's much better to use your aggression in areas where you're attacking a weak range and you're attacking shows signs of weakness, and sometimes the pot is already big, but you can see that they didn't like the turn. And that's when you need to pounce on them with aggression. You don't need to try to get them to fold aces. If you put it in a solver that someone has an unbalanced range and you give them too many strong hands and they use too big of a sizing, what the solver does as an exploit is just to fold. And you're already exploiting them by not bluffing them and by folding your middling hands because they were actually meant to win a decent pot when they have aces. That's how it goes. And if you don't pay them off and don't bluff into them needlessly, that is already how you exploit them, and you're already sort of owning them, and you don't have to do something crazy to get them off aces needlessly. So even though it can make for really legendary plays, so for people who know this famous hand with Isildur 1, Victor Blum, it's probably just not super advisable, and you should maybe pick your spots and bluff people in when they're not telling you that they have an overpair. And then some other advice for loose aggressive players: make sure you get paid when you have it. That's basically why you cultivate this sort of image. Don't suddenly slow play the one time you actually hit something. Just keep playing as you normally do and get paid. And then understand that Payjump Pressure tightens ranges, and your bluffs that go well on day one may no longer go well when you're up against really tight ranges. So if you often find yourself going out during day two before reaching the money, maybe that's the reason, because you're not adjusting, while your opponents now are leaning much more towards premium hands when they continue against you 3-bet. And then lastly, just make sure your story makes sense when bluffing, especially when you play against good players. Sometimes pure pressure just works on people, even if the story doesn't make much sense. But if you're up against thinking players, they might get suspicious if something doesn't add up. And the last part of playing contrary to your image and sort of reducing your exploit surface where pros can exploit you because you're understudied is a piece of advice for if you reach a big stack and the Payjump pressure tightens up and you can pressure other stacks. So in that situation, I think it's great to expand your ranges a bit and actually put pressure on others. That is what you should do. But it can be hard to play this, and if you're unsure about the specifics of playing with a big stack and applying pressure, lean towards the safer play, meaning you should expand, definitely should expand a bit, but don't go all the way towards what a solver would do. And be sort of mindful of how pros might try to test you and play back at you. And so, because it's actually difficult to defend a wide opening range, even if you are a chip leader. And the theory aspect is that what you want to avoid is having too big of a raise fold gap, meaning if you raise with quite a wide range and then they continue aggressively against you with a 3-bet, if you then fold too much of a percentage of your hands, they auto profit and they can just always raise you with bad hands, and you will just bleed chips to them because you're thinking you're applying pressure by always opening pre-flop, and then they 3-bet you every time and you just fold, and that will go poorly. So the ways to shrink this raise fold gap that you have is, there are two options: calling more and 4-betting more. And calling is often the worst option. If you're quite a deep stack and you can afford it, sure, you can play some calls, like hands like King 10 suited and similar make for decent calls, or like Ace Queen offsuit. When it's not good enough to get in, then call Ace Queen offsuit or whatever. But you also need to shrink the raise fold gap by 4-betting, and the details are too nuanced to go into in this video, and it's often spot dependent, or always spot dependent. But just so you have a rough idea what chip leaders are meant to do against players who sort of test them with raises, is that your suited aces will often just go all in to apply maximum pressure and make them fold pretty much everything, because if the payjump pressure is high, they don't really want to flip against you, even if they know you have a lot of bluffs. And then with offsuit ace-x, that would do too poorly when called. If they go all in, they 4-bet non-all-in alongside your actually strong value hands. And you don't do it with every offsuited ace-x, because remember, there are always 12 combinations, 12 ways you can have offsuited ace 10, ace 9, ace 8, ace 7, and so on. So if you always 4-bet with all of them, you are now 4-betting too much. But often in these spots, the solver just mixes roughly half the time with a lot of those, and that's kind of how you can open a lot of hands, and then you're not vulnerable against the 3-bet because you often 4-bet. And if this sort of play sounds very complicated and scary to you, that's okay. Just don't expand your range as much as a solver would when you're the chip leader. You will lose a bit of EV that way, but that's okay. You're not the best player in the tournament. Still do a bit of expanding, still pressure people a little bit, and maybe every now and then you will find one of these 4-bets, or you just think this player has seen you be quite active. They're probably bluff raising you now. You have ace 4 suited. It wouldn't be a big deal if you go all in, because they're kind of a small stack compared to yours. Maybe just put them to this test and go all in, and maybe they call you the kings and you win anyway, so it cannot be too bad. But yeah, just only do this sort of thing if your stack is big enough that you can afford it if it goes poorly. And secondly, only do it against player that you think they are testing you with this chip leader strategy, and they actually have 3-bet bluffs in their range. If someone may not have these 3-bet bluffs and 3-bets like too tight of a range, it's just never a bad thing to overfold against a value-heavy range. And you're not meant to be always aggressive as the chip leader. It's fine to fold. It's fine to, lose these pots. Even if you lose a few pots in a row, just take it easy, calm down, and continue playing good poker. And yeah. So now we've gone through all the points basically, and I'll just give a brief recap. So what we've covered is play a position tighter as an advice to reduce the chance of making big mistake. register maximum late, prioritize shallow stack studying, especially all-in lines. And then to avoid getting exploited and maybe every now and then get in a counter exploit, be deceptive in your game, have bluffs, use sort of sizings not only with value, but play the same way sometimes when you have bluffs, or play give ups the same way as your bluff catchers. So just that you're not too transparent. Then use your image to your advantage. It depends on what your image is, but you know what your style is, and people will probably guess at the right sort of vibe, and then think about how others see you, how they might try to exploit you, and play contrary to that. And then this point about big stack bullying, it's great if you have a big stack and you should expand, but don't push it too much because it can also get risky, and be mindful of this concept of having too big of a raise fold gap as the chip leader. And then recap of the ICM heuristics that I went through. Remember that at the latest, at 30% of the field left, you can no longer follow these chip EV charts and no longer just play the all-in lines that show up in these charts. You have to think more about whether the all-in is actually making sense, and just the thresholds go up. Some of the strongest all-in hands might still be all-ins even with ICM pressure, but you just have to think about it, and yeah, the thresholds go up. Then big blind defense tighten up really a lot when you're covered. And then under ICM pressure, you gradually move away. So the more ICM pressure there is, the more calling just becomes kind of a bad play with most hands. Again, ace jack suited, ace queen suited, something like pocket tens or pocket jacks when it's too strong to get in is rarely terrible, but you move towards 3-bet or fold, and under extreme ICM pressure, there will be no calling anymore in theory. And then lastly, be aware who you're up against. So against big stack bullies, if they truly open very wide to pressure others, you should have fold equity when you go all in. But against mid stacks similar to yours, it's maybe better to proceed with caution, because you will often both play more passive than usual and maybe pot control, and only you really bloat the pot or go all in when you're confident that you're likely going to be way ahead. So that's it. I hope that was helpful and gives you confidence for the big tourney that you might play, and good luck in that.